Welcome back to BrainWise, Our Lives Decoded. Of course, I am one of your hosts today, Cole Bastian. I'm joined by my fabulous co-host, Phil Dixon, and we are here to continue our journey of discovery of our brains and how we can use that information to decode our life. Last week, we talked about and began part one all around worldview and our personal paradigms. And we took an initial dive into what does that mean and how we can begin to use that information to understand how we may be reacting in situations. This week, we're going to continue that discussion and wrap it up so that way we have all of the necessary information to understand where our worldviews and where our personal paradigms may be influenced from. But before we dive in, Phil, how are things going before we get started today?
The latest on the kitchen is that we are finishing putting the cabinetry, the little bits and pieces around the top of the cabinetry. And this afternoon, we should have our final inspection done. And then on Monday, at least I'm keeping my fingers crossed, we've been promised that we actually have some appliances going in. So maybe by Monday evening, I'll actually be able to boil an egg inside the house. That's my goal.
Yeah, I know you told us last week that was the goal, that you've reduced your expectations down to being able to boil an egg in a pot with water. For myself, I've been really focused on finishing this book that I told you I'd started probably about a month or so ago, and we shared with our BrainWise friends. And it's actually probably a really perfect time for it to come to fruition, because a lot of information that I'm seeing come in from the industry or the profession of L&D is that there's a need for L&D leaders and L&D organizations within a company to really become transformative or transformation leaders. And that's really what my book is about, because that's what we've been doing for the last number of years. So very excited about it. It's given me a renewed sense of purpose to get it completed. And so I've got a lot of really good things that are happening in that realm. But what's your BrainWise or brain unwise moment from the past several days?
It was actually yesterday. So I'm a list maker. I make lists every day of what I want to get done during the day. And yesterday I realized somewhere around 2:00 in the afternoon that I was getting frustrated that there were some of the big items that I put on my to-do list that I wasn't getting around to. And then I realized, no, I put them on because I didn't want to forget them. They had to be done. And I think taking a moment to reflect on, first of all, it's a habit I have of making a to-do list. And most of the time it works. Occasionally I have to slap myself around the face and go, pay attention. No one's going to die if these 2 or 3 things don't get done. Catch it. And as I'm starting to think back on most of these things, a lot of our BrainWise moments are catching ourselves rather than just going into automatic pilot. So that was my BrainWise moment yesterday.
Congratulations on being aware. We've shared many times that the number one thing, or the first step really, is to be aware or self-aware of what might be happening. And then what you do after becoming self-aware is the next step, which is awesome because it allowed you to probably still feel a sense of accomplishment, even though there were a couple of things that you had on there as reminders. Your mind or your brain had been telling you that you needed to accomplish them in spite of the purpose of them being there.
And it's all about, for me on that particular issue, is that I'd written them down because I didn't want to forget, but they didn't have to be done. And we all put things on there for different reasons, and that was mine. Yeah. So separating out what must be done versus what would like to be done, it's almost like the same thing, separate out what's urgent versus important.
Yeah, we've always taught a framework for kind of prioritizing your day called the priority matrix, which has 4 quadrants: urgent and important. I won't go through all of them. Maybe it's something we can talk about in the future, but it reminded me of that because there are things that you want to remind yourself to do, but it doesn't mean that it has to be done right now. Stop everything that you're doing to get it done, but certainly can feel that way in some senses.
Right.
So, yeah, and my BrainWise moment for the week, I won't name the company because I want to protect their integrity, and it's certainly not probably a reflection of them in their totality. But we had a contract for our internet service for a number of years, and went up. Then they started charging us more, which fine, whatever. We all know that happens. That's not a big issue. Is that we didn't have unlimited data, that I was unaware of that, and we were going over it. And so we were getting charged $10 for every 1 gig. And it was just getting outrageous. And so I decided I needed to it's been about 4 months since it went up. And so I went in and I started chatting with the folks online. And one person told me that I could get this particular deal and then changed it a little bit later on the speed bandwidth that they were going to give me for that deal. And then when I asked for clarification, then transferred me to somebody else. So then I'm talking to this new person, and the new person online told me a totally different deal. So I was just so very frustrated. So I finally got him to copy, or her, I'm not exactly sure, but got him to copy all of the chat notes into the notes on my account. So then I pick up the phone and I call. I talked to a first lady. She was really nice. She started explaining all of this backstory, and I just asked her I didn't need all of the history. I just needed to know what the resolution was, but she was fabulous. And I prefaced when I spoke to her, I'm frustrated, not with you, but with just the service I'm getting overall from the organization. I've been a longtime customer. So anyways, she finally transfers me to her supervisor because she's not going to be able to support me or resolve the issue. In the midst of it, they were chatting before I got over there. He said, we'll just have him add unlimited data to what he already has, but then I would actually be paying more than all of the deals combined. So initially I thought in my mind, that's not a very good supervisor. He's not being very helpful because that's not the point of me calling. Finally get on the phone with the gentleman, and I was just befuddled is the only word I can really think of, because immediately I get on and I hate it when they do this. They ask me, how can I help you? You already know the history on my account. Why are you asking me to repeat? It's only we really feel should do a BrainWise customer service training, because that is not BrainWise. I'm already pissed, and now you're asking me to relive the pissed off experience? For heaven's sake, at least acknowledge that I'm going through something. Anyways, so I prefaced to him, I just want you to know none of this has to do with you. It's just related to the company. And I managed my emotions because it's not his fault. But I said I went through the experience, and then he starts interrupting me. And it is the most disrespectful thing to interrupt another person, especially in a moment when I'm already frustrated. And I said, sir, can you please not interrupt me? I just want to finish my thought, and then I'll let you say whatever it is you need to say. And he starts interrupting me again. And then he starts raising his voice. And I said, sir, I'm not sure why you are raising your voice and interrupting me. I'm the customer. I'm the client. I'm just trying to get a resolution here. And I've only been talking to you for 2 minutes. I'm the one that's been dealing with this for 2 hours, and I'm not even raising my voice. And then he starts to get even more irate and saying, you have to let people finish their thoughts, and goes into all of this. And I just sat there in total amazement that I was being spoken to by a supervisor of a company that wants my money, but then doesn't now want my money. And I said, so my BrainWise moment was I was able to manage my emotions all the way up until this point. I didn't raise my voice. I took deep breaths throughout the experience, reminded myself it wasn't them. But then I had an unwise moment at the very end, Phil. And instead of using a string of colorful language, I simply told him this. It sounds like you need to go back to training. Therefore, I'm going to hang up. Click. I was done. So it was my nicest way of saying, go crawl in a hole, figure out your life, whatever it is that you need to do, because I'm done talking to you. I literally the next minute got online, got us on a different service provider. They came in, they set us up yesterday. And let me just tell you, it's 10 or 20 times faster download and upload speeds than what we had before for the same price for 5 years. So I'm done. They lost a long-term customer because they had a brain unwise leader who was talking to me, and I just said, I'm over it. I'm finished. So I had BrainWise moments and an unwise moment. I think that's the crux of my story here, is they can be very intertwined. And the more I probably was depleting my prefrontal cortex all the way up until the very end. And that's where that little sentry on duty, which I now have a character that represents it in my brain, came out with its spear and just said,
you're done. You're done.
Yes, I'm done in the nicest way humanly possible. So that's where we are.
I think that was a reflection of you are the weakest link. Click.
Basically, that is where I was at. But it was a good week overall. And now we have great internet service. I'm looking at the bright side is now uploads go faster, posting to different things, download, everything works better. It's just unfortunately I had to go through that really terrible experience to get here. But here we are. And now we're going to have better internet service moving forward. So that's a blessing.
It sounds like you've done a great thing. And it reminds me of we're recording this on a Friday. I don't know, recording on a Friday. One of the things that we could ask as a reflection question is where were your BrainWise and unwise moments during the week? If you're a listener, and just reflect back on what was wise and what was unwise from a brain perspective this week.
Yeah, especially based on what they've been learning as we've been sharing all this information. I'm sure that you'll find some that will provide you a little bit of humor and then others that you can give yourself the gold star that you made some really good choices along your journey.
I think the idea of doing a BrainWise customer service podcast would be a really good thing to do.
I think so too. I think we could make a fortune by taking it to this one particular company for sure, because they're massive. And I'm sure he is not the only one that does not have good customer service.
I'm sure you're right.
And maybe we'll chalk it up to he had a bad day. I don't know. But my belief is, I think Oprah Winfrey said this: when someone shows you who they are, you better believe them. On that moment, he showed me he did not really care about me. So I just believed that he didn't, and I moved on.
There we go. It's very simple in some ways.
It is. It's very simple. All right, let's dive into the next part, or kind of part 2 of worldview and our personal paradigms, influences. And we're going to just take a deeper look at where some of those influences that shape our worldview and our personal paradigm, where they might come from and how it might translate into our life and why it's so important for us to reflect on it and be aware of it. So, Phil, I'm going to dive right in and I'm going to ask you probably a really interesting question, and one that I think our listeners will really enjoy hearing the answer on. How do genetics and upbringing each play a role in shaping behavior?
It's funny. I'm reading a wonderful book at the moment, and in it, the guy talks about nature versus nurture. And really, that's what we're talking about here. Is it genetics that are important, or is it the way you were brought up? And right. He turns around and says, it's a silly argument. He said, it's about as useful as arguing which is more important in the calculation of an area, the height or the width. And he said, you can't identify one is more important than the other. And that's a great metaphor for what we're talking about, nature and nurture. They are absolutely interlinked. And, what's more important? I'm actually going to read you something that was published in 2000. So 25 years ago. I'm sure that there might be a different opinion, but the title of the article was "The Debate is Over." And the guy writes, the first law of genetics is that all human traits are heritable. Is the effect of being raised in the same family is smaller than the effect of genes. Okay, so it has an effect, but it's not as great. And the law, and I love this part, a substantial portion of the variation in complex human behavioral traits is not accounted for by the effects of genes or families. So in other words, there's two that we know about, and then there's this big, as I think you put it at one point, mystery. And I, in my book, and I'll just show that to people, wrote this a while back, Understand Your Brain for a Change. And I'm not trying to promote, but if you want it, it's got some pretty good detail in it. And so there you have it. It's yes, no, or maybe. That's what we know about genetics. We do know that it does have an impact. We're not going to even get into the point of what I'll call epigenetics, which is not only your genes have an impact, but the context in which your genes are actually operating at any given time can be influenced by stress or other such things, which actually means that you're either more or less likely for those genes to get expressed in some way, shape, or form.
Wow.
I think you had said at one point, it's like the movie, it's complicated. It's complicated, but we do know that they have an impact. I did read somewhere many, many months ago that somebody has basically said the impact of your genes is between 35 and 40%. The impact of your upbringing is between 35 and 40%. You've got the unknown factor, but this person also then turned around and said, you've got your current state of what's going on. What's going on in your life. You all know about my kitchen issues for the last 3 months. that does impact how we're doing. I'm dealing with a lot more stress on a day-to-day basis than I was 3 months ago. So
Right.
you've got the mystery factor, you've got the genes, you've got family, you've got your upbringing and your current state. They're all impacting your behavior.
Absolutely. It's interesting because one of the things that I was thinking about is from a perspective of relationships. A lot of times we all have quirks or little things that might make us a little quirky or
Only you do.
only I do. I'll take it on. That's okay. I'm definitely quirky. There is no doubt about it. I think people can probably tell I have quite a personality. Both things that are good and then things that certainly don't always serve me well, and I have to rein in from time to time. But it's all of that probably comes from part genetics, as you were describing it, part childhood, and then part mystery. But understanding all of it allows us to offer grace in some settings, right? That not everything is done with intention, even though we're still responsible for the impact. Not everything that we're doing it intentionally. Sometimes it just is a part of our psychological makeup or our overall perspective of worldview, and we just are reacting. So we still need to, of course, be responsible for the impact that our decisions have, but we can also learn to offer grace to others.
Yeah. And just because we don't understand it fully doesn't mean it's not useful to understand. I think
Right.
it is. I forget who it was that said the unexamined life is not worth living. And so I think understanding how all these things at least have an impact, even if we may not be able to be fully comprehensive in our total picture.
Absolutely. Which I think is a good segue into what role do childhood experiences play in shaping how we react as adults?
It's all part of that 35, 40, 50%. There's a TV series published by the BBC called 7 Up. And what it was premised, I think it started in 1955 or somewhere around there. It premised on a credo, which I think one of the religious groups had, which was, show me the boy at 7 and I will show you the man. A very sexist driven statement, but that was in the 50s. But what they did is they identified, I think it was 14 kids of different backgrounds in England, and they've been in them every 7 years. And now they're in their 80s, I think, somewhere. And I don't know, I haven't seen it for a while. But that every 7 years, you could see the fundamental traits that came out when they were 7 years old. You could see them being reflected every 7 years, pretty much through their life. And so I think why it happens, we're not totally sure. One of the things that we do know is that a lot of the fundamentals are laid down in our brain between 0 and 7.
Really interesting. What it sounds like to me, it's something from a previous workshop that I've been a part of where we talk about like the leadership shadow, but applied in this setting, it's almost like our past are casting really long shadows into our life today. And I can think back to, I've gone through some mental models work as a part of me being coached. And one of them is, which comes from childhood in some senses. And actually, I think I shared it on our last podcast where that teacher that I had at one point, now this wasn't childhood necessarily, but it certainly had an impact. And then in childhood, this certainly made a difference. But was that I was going to amount to nothing. It was basically the premise of what she talked about. And so one of my mental models is I have to be the best. There's this belief system that if I'm not the best, then I'm not worthy. Ultimately, as you dig down through the layers, is that I don't feel worthy if I'm not. And so obviously I worked on reframing it and that my best is good enough. But that comes from a lot of places growing up in childhood around vocabulary and just expectations. And no one does anything that's intentionally wrong, I don't think. I mean, in some childhood settings, there certainly are, and we think we all have past in that way. But a lot of times, parents and others that are involved in that, they are maybe unaware of how the experiences are shaping belief systems. And it's not always parents. There's other adult figures, other factors that are happening, but it definitely carries forward. And our responsibility, at least in my belief system as adults, is to identify them and then see where they've served you well up until this point. And then where they don't serve you well, how do you reframe some of those perspectives?
Yeah. And I'll refer back to the book. I wrote a list of about 20 things that we know have an impact. So I'm just going to read them out. Growing up in a single parent family, for whatever reason that is, being an only child, being the eldest child, being the second eldest child, being the youngest child, and all got impacts. being in an emotionally unstable household, being in an emotionally stable household, moving house frequently, never moving house, which was me. I lived in the same house for for the first 18 years. Growing up rich, growing up poor, being bullied, growing up in the country, growing up in the suburbs, in the inner city, a highly religious household, an atheist or agnostic household, close relations who are in jail, growing up with an overbearing parent, growing up with absent parents. I mean, I remember seeing in one of the towns I lived in, it was a support group. It was called Adult Children of Parents. And I think we all have some impact that comes from being parented. Those childhood things that happen, we live out. And it's not just necessarily we live them out all the time. I was reflecting many years back, I was consulting to Apple. And this was Apple in Europe at the time. And they were looking for a new IT director. And the guy came to me and said, "Hey, I think you'd be great for it. Would you like me to put your name in the ring?" I was 28 at the time, 28, 29. My mental model was that someone who is an IT director should be probably in their mid-40s, maybe years old. They were older and wiser than I was at that particular moment. So I actually said, no.
Wow.
Subsequently, I came to find out that when I went and actually joined Apple, at that ripe old age of 30, I was probably in the top 5% in terms of age, and was considered the wise old man at one time, believe it or not. And so we all have mental models derived from somewhere, and that was one that I didn't even know I had.
Right.
And so that was certainly a sliding door moment that I missed.
Very interesting. And the power to be able to look back and reflect on it, because I'm sure that mental model has shown up maybe in other places. And I know that as you were talking about childhood and upbringing and parents, I had there were challenges, of course, I think as all families do. My mom has been a significant influence on my life forever, and she did a really great job. And then there's things that, that had an impact to create mental models, both that serve me well and that don't, because it's just like we talk about, Phil, with strengths, how we say that a strength overplayed becomes your fatal flaw. I think a lot of it is it's very similar in context, that mental models are shaped probably to some degree to keep us safe or drive certain decision making. And it serves us well. Like, I have to be the best served me well to get me to advance as quickly as I was able to within an organization. But then there was a point where it wasn't serving me well, because I got where I needed to go. I didn't recognize that I needed to change behavior initially, and it created some challenges. And so now that mental model was no longer serving me well. And then when I became aware of it is when I was able to then make some decisions on how to reframe and then change different behaviors afterwards.
And I think that Marshall Goldsmith, and for those listeners that don't know who he is, he's probably one of the most recognized corporate coaches in America. He gets paid a fortune for even an hour's work. But he wrote a book. It was titled "What Got You Here Won't Get You There." And once you understand the title, you don't have to read the book. And what got you here was a whole bunch of mental models and your upbringing and all those things. But it may not get you where you want to go next. You may have to give those goodbye.
Absolutely, which is a part of growth. We're ever evolving as human beings and as people. And so how do we use that to help us grow? Which I think is a really nice segue into, Phil, what are Frederick Hudson's life cycles and why are they important?
Oh, so Frederick Hudson, first of all, I hope he rests in peace. He passed on about a decade. He had an institute in Santa Barbara, I think it is, called the Hudson Institute, which still teaches his working. But I don't think we've discussed this before, but he had a challenge to the mental models that many of us hold. And that is a mental model that certainly in the Western world we tend to hold, or the up and to the right model. And that is that as life progresses, things get better. And if you draw a graph of it, it's up and to the right. So whether that's your success or whether it's your wisdom or your money or your position or whatever, everything goes up and to the right. And he said, but in my research, that's not the case. Life is more, and these are my words, not his, life is more of a spiral. And he drew a circle with 4 quadrants. And he said, we start off in the top left-hand quadrant and we're all gung-ho. And I think that's actually the phrase he used. And we're into it. And then we get to the top where we plateau and we start coming down the other side where we're bored. And we decide we're going to change things. And so we choose a different company to go and work for, or we choose a different role in the same company or whatever it might be. And we have a new job. We go straight over to the gung-ho part of it. We're gung-ho. And then we do the same thing again. And it might take us 6-7 years to go through. Then we're getting bored again. But each time we go around that semicircle, it's a shorter and shorter trip to get to the point where he calls it organismic disgust. We cannot tolerate that process anymore. And then we go, and so that's been happening in the top half of the circle. Then what happens is we drop down into the bottom right-hand quadrant, which he calls cocooning, and we step back from life. And we look around and go, what's it all about, Alfie? It's an old song that you might remember. And we step back and we cocoon, either literally where we leave our jobs and we spend some time going fishing or whatever it might be, or we mentally step back and we're not quite as engaged as we were till we invent whatever that's going to come out of that cocoon. And then we go into the bottom left where we get ready for our new journey. And then we step up to the top left again, and it happens as a circle. When I've used that for coaching people, it's actually been a much easier, it's been a more relatable model for people to say, yes, I'm in this moment, or I'm here, or I'm in that transition across from boredom back into gung-ho-ness, or I'm in cocooning. And so it gives people an opportunity to understand the model and settles people a little bit, go, oh, that's where I am.
Exactly. And I think the other thing it does is that we can see those plateaus or doldrums that as normal, and it can possibly take some of the shame away of feeling I'm just stuck or I'm not moving forward or I feel just whatever the emotion is. It's normal. Everyone goes through that at some point, and so there's no need to be ashamed of it.
Yeah. And the doldrums is the word he uses. And it helps people position what their next choice is going to be. Because if you're in the doldrums, hey, am I going to go around this circle another time? Yes. Maybe it's time for me to go around and do the same thing in a different company. Or do I need to step back and have a bigger transition and transformation in my life?
It can also probably be experienced in our personal life too, where a relationship or something that we're doing outside of the work context begins to feel monotonous or just the same, and you're in a rut, as some people would describe it. And a lot of people ask, what's wrong? And maybe it's not that anything's necessarily wrong. It's that you're in that space of you plateaued. Now it's about figuring out how to re-bring life into that relationship, whatever it might be, discovering new things about each other, creating different perspective, or going on new experiences and learning with one another. It's just a need to reinvigorate the experience to be able to move into being really gung-ho again.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point because, and I can illustrate it, ever since I was 7 years old, I was passionate about photography. And I had some small success in my teens, getting some pictures published in UK magazines. And so,
congrats.
Thanks. And so my circles around were different cameras. As more cameras came out that were actually better, and as I could afford more, I went around that top circle many times until the point was I had bought some new camera equipment and I realized I was bored. There was nothing. It didn't feel like there was anything new. That it's time for me to basically give that hobby up and go and move on to my next one. So I think that's a really good example of it not being work oriented, but the things. And that was probably a 60-year process.
Wow, that's amazing. And who knows, maybe there'll be a point where you pick up when you really enjoy it again, or maybe not. But recognizing to extend grace that it's okay because you're probably discovering new hobbies like writing and going through all of the different things you've been doing in the last number of years that are new hobbies of yours.
And remodeling kitchen.
Which I'm curious if that's going to land on the hobby side or the I never want to do this again side.
I can guarantee which one it's going on.
I'm sure our BrainWise friends can also pick very easily which side of the coin it's going to be. Let's transition a little bit because I'd like to talk just a moment about purpose, passion, and values and how that shapes our worldview and influences us in our personal paradigms or mental models, whatever name people choose to use to describe it. Why is purpose such a powerful driver for our lives and help shape some of those things?
It provides a context, a bowl, if you like, or whatever it is, that encapsulates how you can make other decisions. That if you make every decision based on where does it lead to my purpose, then it just makes it easier to make the decisions. I think we talked about, I believe we had a conversation about Teller of Penn and Teller. Did we talk about that sometime?
I'm not sure. Maybe we can share it again.
Penn and Teller are the magicians on TV, together for a long, long while. And I had the pleasure of working with Teller on a board of directors at one time. And I can tell you on TV, he's silent. On a board of directors, he's definitely not. And so we had a conversation once when I was asking him about how he got to where he is. I think he referenced the fact he used to teach classics on somewhere the East Coast, but had always been a favorite of magicians and Houdini in particular, and decided that's where he wanted to go. And that's where he was. And he said, so I asked him, what advice do you have for people who want to go through a large transition like that? And he said, always do something that's in line with where you want to go. So if you want to be an actor, don't take a job in a restaurant. Take a job in the theater. So that everything you do lines up with that next purpose you have. And I think that's one of the reasons why having a purpose, having passion, having a set of values, all those things, if you can live your life in accordance with all of that, you're probably going to be more successful, and you're certainly going to have a happier and more joyful life.
For sure, because I think we talked a little bit about this, but it's the purpose and passions that we have are the North Star that we're trying to accomplish. And then I've always seen values as the inner compass to get us there. But then really it's how are we showing up? What are the behaviors that we are so important for ourselves and how we want to represent ourselves to the world? And if we can live in those and we can be in an organization or be in spaces where they're being honored, we feel at peace. But when they're violated, we feel threatened or we don't feel that inner peace anymore. And I just think it's really interesting. And that can be applied in both the work and the personal context. Is your purpose and passion aligned with either of those two paradigms? And then is that experience aligning with your values? Is it honoring them? And if not, then what would need to change in order for it to honor it? Because I'm personally experiencing a little bit of that in my professional life and making some choices to do something different so that it can better align as I move along my journey.
Yep.
And let's talk a little bit about, Phil, the environment and how environment plays a role in influencing us from a perspective of our worldview and our personal paradigm. So how does our current environment influence how we respond every day?
Drastically influences it. We talked earlier on about the fact that it's genetics, it's your upbringing, a mystery factor, and your current state. What's going on with you? And if you can imagine what's going on in your current context, you almost can call it the psychological threat context. What else is coming in and providing a stress load on you? And it can be things like him changing job, or for example, I am moving house, I am getting married, I'm getting divorced, we're having a kid, I've got a parent that's going through dementia, I've got to be the care person for an invalid, I've got a kid that's just had an accident. All of those things all bundle together to put us under a larger and larger load. And if you've got a big load going on like that, that's probably not the time to decide, hey, I want to do a change in my career. You might want to settle down and wait for things to settle down. Well, no, is that all those things can be drastic on you if you don't feel like you're in control. The research done on being in control is huge, and it impacts health. It impacts recuperation. They've done some studies which basically, when people are in control of their situation in a hospital, on average, they'll come out for the same disease or illness. They'll come out a day earlier if they feel like they've got control over. It's simple things like, can I give myself pain medicine, or do I have to ask the nurse for pain medicine?
I have a personal example of that. When all of these things professionally started happening and we're in the midst of this transition, at first I had non-consciously, I think, or maybe it was somewhat forced to some degree, but I had relinquished control over my destiny, specifically in my career, to an unknown group of individuals. And so there was, and you remember this because I was talking to you about it for a couple of months, there was several, probably about 2.5 months where I was just going through the cycles and probably non-consciously trying to prove that it was necessary for me to stay and all of these different things. Then in the midst of the summer, which was about 2.5 months ago, I just had this realization that part of the reason I was feeling just this, I don't know, anguish and anxiety and all these things, because I wasn't in control. It had nothing to do with the actual job necessarily. It had to do with my destiny had now been relinquished to somebody else. And I choose to, my destiny is only, it's mine and God's. At the end of the day, those are the two people that have influence over it. My spouse, of course, has influence over it. But in terms of who can control where it goes, it's just those two. But I had non-consciously relinquished the control. And when I took it back and said, you know what? Things are different now. I'm going to move forward. I'm going to support in the ways that I need to support, because that's what I need to do and what the organization needs from me and what the people need. At the time that's complete, I'm going to move on in my career. When I said those words out loud, it was powerful because my perspective changed. I felt less anxious, less nervous. I felt all these different things. And there was probably more uncertainty to some degree in that, because now I really don't know what's next, right? But I felt better because I was now in control of where I was headed. So I think I say that because it's a powerful example for us, as where you were describing being in control, for our lists, our BrainWise friends, really to think, where is it that I'm feeling some of the maybe anxiety, nervousness, anxiousness, or whatever the emotion might be? Is it possibly because you don't feel in control of that particular experience? And if so, how can you take a little bit of control back? Or in situations where you can't control it, what are the activities or the strategies you'll use to help let it go in those spaces?
Yeah. And we can delve into this in lots of ways. But one of the things I like to help people think, is it something you can control, or is it something you can influence?
Yeah.
And if it's neither of those two things, it's probably the law of physics that you're not going to change it. So there's a point where you have to come to acceptance.
Right.
But there's some great work done by a professor, I think she's still at Harvard, called Ellen Langer. Have you come any of her work?
The name I recognize, but I don't specifically remember any of the work.
I think she was the first tenured female professor at Harvard, if I remember right.
Wow.
And I believe she's still there. But she did some fabulous experiments 25, 30, 40 years ago. And one of the things she did was she took a group of older men they were 80 years old, and she put them into a location where essentially they were back to when they were 55. And the environment they went back into, the TV programs they watched, everything was as though they were 55 years old. They measured all sorts of markers. You can research this on the internet. They did all sorts of markers, and they found in 1 week, pretty much every marker improved by between 5 and 10%.
Wow.
Their flexibility, their dexterity, their cognition, their memory, everything improved. But there was no change. There was nothing done physiologically to their body. It was all their mindset about how old they were. They had another, and so that's about the mindset. And then she said, I wonder if that applies to everyone. And so they did another experiment in an old people's home. And the only change they made was that they gave them a pot plant to tend to. And they got to select the pot plant. They get to decide where it was, to feed it, to water it, and take care. And that was their choice. And they found it took longer, but within 2 months, everybody who had something to do and therefore it was in their control had way better cognition, had way fewer needs for drugs and all sorts of things like that. It's not only are we in control, but do we have a mindset that says we're in control?
Absolutely. I think there is something to be said for that saying mind over matter. If we can put ourselves in the mind frame or the mindset that we can do this or we can accomplish it or I am in control, it certainly changes the outcome on the other side for, I'm sure, a variety of reasons.
Yeah. And I'm going to take a guess here. And that is many of us had a mindset that we were in control when we were 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. And then probably in many cases, it got knocked out of us by those examples that you were talking about earlier on about that teacher. I think there's a statute of limitations on being able to blame what happened to you before you were 21. I think you're allowed to use that up until when you're 30. After the 30, you got to reintroduce a different mindset.
You're being far more gracious than I probably would. I'd say, okay, once you reach the ripe age of 21, say goodbye to the old ways and introduce yourself to new ones. Now, there can be reasons for why there be an internal response or that it becomes a moment of threat, but what you do with it is entirely your choice. Like when I recognize what I talked about, it's certainly something that shaped a paradigm or an experience for me throughout my life, but it's not her fault at all how I've showed up throughout my life. That's entirely myself. And I have to be able to take a step back and say, okay, where did it serve me? Where did it not serve me? Then now, how do I change it?
Right.
And I think that leads into kind of the next part of the conversation, Phil, which is what does this, when we talk about strengths, and I mentioned this a little earlier, that strengths and opportunities is what I call it, but weaknesses is what a lot of people refer to it as. Same thing, weaknesses, opportunities. What does the strength-based approach teach us, and where can it possibly mislead us?
I think that a strength-based approach, and it's become one of the paradigms in our industry, learning and development, is the strengths of rose. It is absolutely true. If you go with your strengths and you don't overplay it, then you're probably in a better shape to be successful. However, I think we got into trouble probably 10 or 15 years ago where everybody started to focus only on their strengths. That can get you into trouble. I think you can, when you're an individual contributor, I think it's reasonable to say, yeah, I can focus on my strengths. But once you start taking a leadership role or a management role or a supervisory role, then that your weaknesses come bite you in the butt because you cannot ignore. You can mitigate. You may never be able to become great at something that was a weakness. I'm not sure I believe that, but let's go with that as a paradigm for the moment. But at least you can mitigate it being an anchor for you moving forward.
Right.
So strengths, yes, play to them, and don't ignore your weaknesses, because I think it was Jackie Chan talked about it's the weakness that's going to get you killed, or it's the strength that you overplay is going to get you killed.
I think there's probably some semblance of balance in this case. And maybe there in the work context, there's a bit more, a larger degree of your time is focused on playing to your strengths, but you can't forget about where your opportunities or your weaknesses are. And I think my assumption is we made a shift initially to focus on strengths because everything was so weakness oriented. When you think about performance reviews or coaching conversations, a lot of times the conversation is around where can you improve that you're not doing well in. And it's interesting because my mom, she's been in education for all of her life in elementary education. And she obviously focused on the spectrum of it's about building strength and also working on improving opportunities. But one of the things that she really talked about is if you can help kids find the things that they're really good at and nurture that environment while still teaching them things that they need to know to just live life, the areas they might not be as strong in, but you spend just a little more time nurturing their strengths, that will help them in when they get to become an adult, because that can be what helps them be successful in their career if you can recognize that early on.
Agreed 100%. Yeah.
So I think it's just an interesting conversation. And so one of the other things is we hear a lot about intelligence, and I'm curious, Phil, how does the concept of multiple intelligences expand our view of capability?
guy that's credited with most of the breaking through of what is intelligence is Howard Gardner. And again, worth, if anyone's interested in following up, just do a research on his work. And he introduced the concept, I think it was 9 different types of intelligence. And we focus, certainly in the education side of the house, we focus on, I'll call it intellectual intelligence, the intelligence quotients, IQ. It's become the de facto measure of everybody. His concept was that there are multiple ways of looking at it. And I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but there's things like musical intelligence. I tried to play the saxophone for a period of time. I don't have a lot of musical intelligence. It just doesn't come naturally to me. Physical ability, the ability to do a somersault on a 3-inch bar. You've got to have some intelligence in that body to be able to do that. Emotional intelligence has become a much discussed topic over the last 30 years or so. Perel introduces a thing called erotic intelligence. What's the guy's name? I've forgotten. He introduces cultural intelligence. Mm-hmm. And so there are all different ways, and we've all got different, on a scale of 1 to 10, we've all got different set points in those different intelligences. And I think understanding what your own set point is along those scales, and then you can take a chance. But it's not just intellectual intelligence which drives us. There's way more than those.
Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things is, too, there's multiple intelligences. That means that the smartest person in the room at work may not always be the best leader.
Absolutely.
And in my opinion, it's probably oftentimes not the case. You have to have a high degree of emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence, social probably to a large degree. And those make up leadership characteristics. They have baseline level of being the smartest, being smart, but they're smarter in many other ways that are more effective at leading people. And at home, the other thing is I think these intelligence probably show up as more important depending on the space that we're in. But at home, I can see where emotional intelligence becomes a fairly significant driver of experience and how we may or may not show up in different conversations based off our ability to demonstrate emotional intelligence.
Yeah. And my belief is that we can dig into emotional intelligence by understanding what goes on in our brains.
For sure. Because a lot of it comes down to what you're experiencing as threat, most likely. And then how do you respond after that?
Right.
Yeah. So, Phil, I want to make one final transition to talk about our present outlook to wrap up the conversation on worldview, personal paradigms, mental models, and just things that kind of shape overall our behaviors and our experiences in life. So why is timing so critical when making personal change?
Well, for all of the reasons we've spoken about in these last 12, 13 podcasts, it all comes down to if you're trying to make a personal change, are you ready for that change? Are you able to make the change? Is the context good for you to make that change? If it's an overall large change, step back a moment and go, is now the time? Time can be, as we've talked about, during the day. If you want to start making a new habit, don't start at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday. Start at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Monday morning. Much more likely to have success when you're fresh in doing something than if I'll use the opposite word, if you're stale at the end. So timing is everything, and doing so when you don't have a lot of other stuff going on in your life. Sometimes change is forced upon us where we don't have a choice, but where you do have a choice, hey, I'm going to do something slightly different, then maximize the chances. And you do need to take into account your past. You do need to take into account your recent past, what's just happened, your current context, where you want to go. Sometimes when we invent a future for ourselves, you can't get there immediately. And so we have to come back a little bit and create a first step on our pathway to the future. So in our next book, what's our next chapter?
What's interesting is this is something that I was just talking to a colleague about, because our organization is going through significant change just by virtue of restructuring. And when you look at additional changes that they want to make outside of that, which think about just pulling apart different things, and the organization is going to be different, your boss, there's a lot of change that's already happening. Now there's additional changes around training programs or around operations processes. And I just took a step back and I remember talking to a colleague and said, wait a minute, maybe the recommendation needs to be don't change anything that doesn't have to be changed right away. Allow the rest of this big change to settle first, because how unsuccessful will it be to roll out all of these new ops processes or these new learning trainings or whatever, and then blame the fact that it's the ops process or the way it was rolled out or the training, whatever, on why it failed. In reality, the reason it failed is people can't handle any more change than is already being forced upon them. So let's just take a step back and pause. What's the harm or the risk in not doing it right now? And when we did that type of analysis in our conversation, realized there's really no risk. Let's just take a pause and then dive into the rest of it when that is possible. I think that there's a real life example of how timing really does make a significant difference for us, which I have one more question related to this in terms of our current outlook or our present outlook. How does attitude and stress levels impact our capacity for change?
Well, that's not a question for the end. That's actually a question for the beginning of one of our podcasts. It was attitude. He once said attitude is everything. And I'll call it attitude is as much as anything is mindset. If you have an attitude, and then, who was it? Eleanor Roosevelt said, if you think you can, you'll be right. And if you think you can't, you'll be right. Maybe I just bastardized what she said, but it's words to that effect. So I think your attitude, we also know, is if you can take a positive attitude, it absolutely increases all sorts of other things. It increases the chances that you're likely to sleep better. It decreases the chance that you're going to have stress or the impact of stress. So a positive attitude, there's a whole realm of positive psychology, which I won't go into at the moment, but setting up your attitude. There's an old story that one company decided that attitude was everything. And the person that took upon themselves to actually reflect what was going on was actually the receptionist. And one morning, the CEO walks in and he's gruff. She gets on the internal communication system and says, "Good morning, everybody. Bob's chosen unpleasantness as his attitude today." But that itself turned everything around, because
Totally.
even Bob couldn't be unpleasant at that point.
Right.
So attitude, probably everything.
To me, it's like positive mindsets or positive attitude creates room for growth. High stress certainly shrinks it. And I think if one simple question is now the right time, both at work and at home, because sometimes the kindest move isn't pushing harder, it's pausing until the brain is ready.
Yeah. And some cortisol takes anywhere between 2 and 5 hours to dissipate, depending on your own metabolism and what else you're doing. So if you're in a threat state, don't even try new things particularly. Don't even try planning the future. Your brain is just not in a state for it. Go out for a walk in nature, as we said last week. Go out and spend some time walking in the grass. And I know you don't like walking in the grass, but it actually is a really good stress reliever.
As long as the grass is level, the ground that it's in is level, I'm okay. It's when it's like a slope going down like this, or there's all these little hills in the grass, that's when I don't really enjoy it that much.
Yeah.
But it's also better on your knees and joints and all of that too. So maybe I just need to work through whatever mental model that is and start walking in the grass more.
Yeah, they call it nature. Those hills and things.
Yes, they do. It's funny because I'm sure when my husband listens to this, he'll just get a kick out of it, because when I want to go for a leisure walk, I want it to be a flat line. I don't want to go up a hill, down a hill. I want to go just flat, because then I don't have to sweat. It's just leisurely walking. And sometimes it'll be, oh, let's go this direction, which is straight up a hill. And I'm like, wait a minute, this is a leisure walk.
I do one thing. The view from the top is wonderful.
It is. This is very true. Once you get there, it's certainly worth it. And the journey on the way up, I think it's Miley Cyrus that says it's not the end destination, it's the climb. She has, I don't know if that's exactly her words, but she has a song that's about it's the climb. That's where you learn.
Let's not have you and I try and sing it.
No, although I am a formerly trained vocalist. I didn't do it for many years, but I did do it for several years in high school.
In that case, I'll be the one that opts out. I was in the choir once until they found out what was wrong with it.
You can play the saxophone in the background, and then I'll sing. And Joey, he'll play the tambourine.
Have you ever tried to play a saxophone when you have dogs around?
Oh, I can only imagine they just go bananas.
They go bananas and they start howling. And it's
They're adding to the musical experience.
And very difficult to keep your embouchure when you're trying to laugh at the same time.
Maybe it's a comedy musical that we're going to do. Or
there
something.
We go.
I don't know. There we go.
I think we've just landed on our next gig.
We did, yeah. So if you see us, I will have to come up with a name with what it's going to be so we can tell our BrainWise friends to expect it in the near future.
In the meantime, to our BrainWise friends, don't hold your breath.
Exactly. I think that's a great way for us to wrap up our conversation today. So Phil, are there any last things that you'd like to say or summarize based off what we talked today as we really are wrapping up worldview and personal paradigm before we talk a little bit about what our closing reflection questions are for our BrainWise friends?
Yeah, I think a couple of things come to mind. One is it's always good to step back and do some self-assessment. I think we've used this analogy before, but a lot of people will spend a lot of time planning their next vacation, spending any time on looking at who they are and where they want to go next.
Yeah.
So I think self-assessment, self-awareness, probably self-assessment, self-awareness, and attitude. I'd say those are the three that I would summarize with for today.
That's a great way to summarize. And one of the things we'll probably always just start asking is for yourself as you go through and reflect on today's episode, think about what brain-wise or brain-unwise moments did you have from the previous week. And if you feel so inclined, share them with us at questions@mybrainwisecoach, because we'd love to hear directly from those who are listening, or certainly share it in the comments of the episode, because we are actively watching and responding to those also. We have a couple of additional questions that I'd like to share with our BrainWise friends to just give people multiple opportunities to pick one or two. It's not picking all of them, but which one most resonates with where you are in your present state or your current state, which is which childhood experiences still echo in the way you show up at work or in your relationship? Where are you in Hudson's life cycle right now? Dreaming, plateauing, doldrums, or cocooning? What passions or values feel most alive for you today, and how are they shaping your choices? And how does your current environment support or hinder the changes you want to make? That's our episode for today. This is our look at context and the self we carry forward, from child experiences to life cycles, from passions to values. And we have had a really good conversation around the mix of the past, present, and future influences. So this is part 2 of our worldview and personal paradigms or mental models discussion. I'm sure it's going to show up as we continue having conversations about our brain. If you liked the episode today, or maybe you learned something from it, we would love to have you like, comment, subscribe, and share our podcast with those in your circle, both personally and professionally, so that they too can begin a journey of decoding their life from a BrainWise perspective. And with that, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always stay BrainWise. We'll talk to you next week.